conversation. To set the stage, the Institute of Politics and Public Service is relatively new. We're about 1.5 years old here at Georgetown. And a big part of why we exist is to kind of pull back the curtain and take a look at the intersection of politics, public service, and policy. And so tonight's conversation, I think, is very, very timely. So much of the existence of the Institute, given the timing of our founding, has focused on the presidential campaign. But the campaign's over, and now we turn to the business of governing. And that doesn't mean politics goes away. And so trying to figure out what the political implications and ramifications and opportunities and challenges are around various policy issues is a big focus of ours in this next stage of the Institute's life. And that's why we're here tonight, to talk about politics of the Syrian conflict and figure out whether or not there is a bipartisan solution. I first want to begin by thanking Essie Cup, who's a board member, an advisory board member of the Institute, and Help Me Go Home, the organization she's affiliated with, for coming to us with this idea to have this conversation. It is a critical conversation, and we really hope that this panel can increase awareness amongst the Georgetown community about what's happening in Syria. The goal here tonight is not to have a knockdown, drag them out, partisan debate. Congressman, that's probably a nice change from your day job. But the goal here is really to have people who understand the issue, maybe come to it from different perspectives, but understand this issue and help us identify what are some of the political opportunities in this current political climate, what are some of the political challenges, and is there room for real bipartisanship? It's about conversation and dialogue tonight. And so we're looking forward to hearing this panel get to it. We've got a great panel, and so I'd like to introduce them. I'm going to go down the list in order. I already introduced Essie Cup, a nationally syndicated columnist, author, commentator. You might recognize her from CNN. She's a board member for the organization Help Me Go Home, which advocates for the creation of safe zones in Syria to protect the Syrian people. And as I mentioned, she's also on the advisory board for the Georgetown Institute of Politics and Public Service. Next to her is Ann Richard, currently a visiting fellow at University of Pennsylvania's Perry World House, and more importantly, an alumna and adjunct professor here at Georgetown. She served as Assistant Secretary of State for Population, Refugees, and Migration in the Obama administration from 2012 through the end of the administration, and is a graduate, as I said, of the School of Foreign Service, so Point Sachs. Nora Barre, Congressman Adam Kinzinger, is currently serving his 4th term in the U.S. House of Representatives, proudly representing Illinois' 16th Congressional District, which stretches across 14 counties across northern Illinois. Congressman Kinzinger serves as a member of the House Committee on Energy and Commerce and is on the House Committee on Foreign Affairs. Prior to being elected to Congress, the Congressman served in the Air Force in both Iraq and Afghanistan. Congressman, happy to have you here. Now, Nora Barre, a Syrian American that immigrated to the United States as a young girl with her family in order to escape the dictatorship in Syria. She's been heavily involved in the Syrian cause with several organizations since 2011, including the Syria Fund and Help Me Go Home. She works with Syrian refugees in Jordan with a focus on women and children. Her entire family have become refugees internally and externally displaced due to the bombardment by Bashar al-Assad. And finally, to lead the conversation tonight, anyone that watches CNN will recognize Jim Sciutto, CNN's chief national security correspondent based here in Washington. He reports and provides analysis across all the network's programming and platforms on all aspects of U.S. national security, including foreign policy, the military, and the intelligence community. So with that, please join me in welcoming the panel. And Jim, the floor is yours.
Thanks everyone to you guys, and thanks to my distinguished panel. I want to ask Essie to help us just get the conversation started by, as you were suggesting when you came in, give a brief how we got here.
Well, Syria is a very complicated story to tell, which is probably in part why it doesn't get told very often, in addition to our news cycle being fascinated and so many other things closer to home. But back in 2011, there was a peaceful protest in a city called Da'ara, and it was protesting the Syrian regime, the Assad regime, And in response, the Assad regime took to the streets and murdered innocent civilians. That escalated very quickly, and a lot of different factions were formed, some of which were knowable, others were not, and therefore kind of difficult to track. And since then, Bashar al-Assad has continued to up his war against his own people. In 2013, August, I believe, is when we first learned he was using chemical weapons on his own people. And I don't know if you saw any of those images, but they were absolutely horrifying. That led to infamous red lines that you probably heard about out of the Obama administration that were crossed without much response internationally. Here we are today with 500,000 Syrians dead, 50,000 are children, 8.5 million Syrians are in need of immediate aid, millions are displaced. The people left, the majority of Syrians are not living in Syria anymore. And just today we got another report that Bashar al-Assad had been using chemical weapons as recently as just last December against his own people. So that's where we're at. There's complicated politics on the ground there, but that's essentially what has happened over the past 6 years now. And the point I want to get across in this, and then I'll stop talking, is that you, especially as millennials, are in the unique and uniquely disturbing position of being the first generation to watch a Holocaust, a genocide, in real time, on your devices, on your television, on your social media. So there's no excuse for not really knowing what's going on. Other generations didn't have the immediacy, the urgency that you have for this. So I'm just hoping to impart how important this humanitarian crisis is.
Thank you. So I want to go to Nora next because Nora's from Aleppo, right? And your family, you've experienced it, your family continues to experience it. I just want to share first, when I lived in London for a long time, I was with ABC at the time, and I went to Syria a number of times prior to the uprising. We still have this picture in my living room of two little kids playing with red balloons in the mosque in Damascus. And I look at that, peaceful time. Syria had a lot of problems, but it was peaceful. And so every day when I come home, I look at these little kids and wonder, whether they or their family survive. And each of these numbers, right, is a real person, and no one was that better on this stage than Nora. So I want to ask you, we want to be as forward-looking as possible here. What would you like to see if you could sit in the White House, number 10 Downing Street, the Kremlin? Where would you go to convince people of a solution? What message would you give them?
I think the solution to this problem is to look at the core problem, what's causing this huge displacement of people. And it is the Assad regime bombardment, aided by Iran, aided by Russia. I would love to see a safe zone. A safe zone where people can go home. You have, the population, as Essie mentioned, 21 million Syrians. About, more than half are displaced internally and externally. These people are refugees. They're different than immigrants. They did not choose to leave their country, as my family, my family members and friends. And right now, if there was a safe zone established in Syria, they would go home. They would go back. And they still have hope, despite all the violence that's occurred there the past 5 years. They still want to rebuild, and they still feel that that is where they belong. And so that's what I would do. That's the first thing I would do.
So Anne, and I want to get your thoughts out because I know your opinion on this. Anne, why did the Obama administration not do it? And do you think that the circumstances today still make it too difficult, too costly, not financially, but costly in terms of danger, et cetera?
Well, it was certainly looked at by the Obama administration repeatedly. It was brought up in interagency discussions in the White House. And time again, it was decided it couldn't be done. I think
why?
I'll answer it, but I think we should continue to push ourselves to analyze it and figure out if an opportunity exists. One big reason not to was because the Pentagon saw it as a backdoor way into getting more involved in conflicts in the Middle East. The president did not think that the public would support another U.S. involvement in another war in addition to Iraq and Afghanistan. And then from our perspective of my bureau, the Humanitarian Assistance Bureau, we were trying to figure out how do we get aid and aid workers to the people, and how do we ensure people are protected in the places which they are. And that has failed to happen. But there was a great concern that we not set up an area, call it safe, and then not have it be safe. Making it safe is the part that's so hard. And everyone remembers Srebrenica from the Balkans War, where the UN Security Council declared a safe haven, and then 8,000 men and boys were massacred because the Dutch peacekeepers were unable to stop the Bosnian Serbs from killing them. So that, I think, that's the trick, is how to have an area that can be kept safe. Fred Hoff recently wrote a piece that said, you can't keep it safe from 30,000 feet up in the air. It's not just air power. You have to have boots on the ground. You have to be professional militaries. They can't just be militia. That's his view. He would know more about it, the congressman may know more about it than I do, because I'm coming at it from a different perspective, which is let's not offer something that we can't guarantee will be safe. Now, in the meantime, there is a gray zone, as it's being called right now, an area where there isn't bombing taking place. It's up against the border with Turkey. It's the Euphrates Shield area, and people are going through this area, some going home, some trying to flee out, although the border is very tight. But it's not really a place people want to go home to and make their homes there. The surrounding countries, Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, would very much like safe zones. They would like to push refugees back. And one of the key humanitarian principles that we adhere to is that people not be forced back, that they be allowed to go home when they choose to go home voluntarily, when it's safe to do so. So these are some of the considerations.
So Adam, I know you're a proponent of safe zone, and still today.
Yeah.
Why is it doable when you've heard those reservations?
Well, I think it's doable with and I think you're correct in saying that the American people weren't ready for a third intervention, I guess, in the Middle East. But that's because it wasn't sold to them. And if you look at any time in American history when we do military intervention, unless it's like a last minute, something happened, we have to act that day. But any lead up to conflict, a president has always spent time explaining to the American people why it's in their interest, from the Oval Office, from press conferences, from everywhere else. And it's over those series of leadership discussion, those speeches, in which the American people who are paying attention are looking and say, okay, the situation in Syria does affect me, not just from a humanitarian perspective, and I'm sad that there's a lot of dead people, but from a perspective of security and stability, and from a perspective of, we could see this fire that Assad has lit and created ISIS as a result. That could spread into destabilization in Jordan. Jordan has basically the equivalent of the population of Canada living in the United States without a job. And so that's a real issue. And so it takes presidential leadership. And with all due respect, because I really do believe politics ends at the water's edge. I think you can be critical of policy, but that we ought to be as united as possible. But I don't think over the 8 years, the president showed the kind of leadership necessary to bring the American people along. We are willing to do very tough things. We are willing to do very difficult things. But we have to have explained to us why that's important. And I think had the president taken the time to explain to the American people, you know what, there will have to be a professional military on the ground. Some of it may be ours, some of it may be the Jordanians, Saudis, everything else, Turks. But this is why it's in our interest, and I think it could have been done.
SC, will the Trump administration make a different move?
Well, so to Ann's point, I mean, a lot of the conditions for safe zones were not right. The American public, as Congressman said, was not there. Safe zones, apart from Syrian intervention, actually have bipartisan support, though. I mean, Hillary Clinton, John Kerry, John McCain. It's not a controversial idea within politics of Republican Democrats, but the American people were not there. And President Obama did not have a particularly good relationship with Russia, and had, I think, through some tough talk that didn't get backed up, kind of put Assad in an awkward position. Trump, for all of his flaws, I am hoping can turn this coziness with Vladimir Putin, which scares me on a number of levels, but on this area, into an asset. While I think most people hear safe zones and imagine boots on the ground, and that might be necessary, I actually believe that Trump might be uniquely positioned to negotiate a diplomatic safe zone through Putin and Assad. Look, Russia is sanctioned to the hilt. If Trump is in a position to release some of those sanctions on Russia in exchange for a safe zone in Syria that Putin then gets Assad to back and stay out of, and Assad can continue shelling in the name of rooting out terrorists outside of that, I actually think, maybe I'm Pollyanna about this, but I actually think that that could happen. It would be an early good foreign policy win for Trump. It would make him look tough on Russia while giving something in exchange, and he'd be able to do something the previous administration did not. So I'm hopeful, actually, that we could do this diplomatically. But yes, it's possible we might have to do this with boots on the ground.
So Nora, you and your family would have to trust Assad, who has led a slaughter, right? And Russia, who's aided and abetted that slaughter, and Iran as well, to sign on to something like that, possibly in exchange for something else. Would you trust an agreement based on that?
I personally don't believe that any safe zone could be negotiated for the legitimacy of the Assad regime, who's killed over 500,000 people. I think that, it's a start. It's a start, having the safe zone and allowing civilian society and local councils to flourish and possibly provide an alternative to the Assad regime is a beginning to sort of having them possibly taking over the governing. But I would not trust Assad. I just, over and
They
over
would
again.
have to be part of the play. You'd have to, right, if it's going to work.
Right, but then we would have to, the safe zone, Mr. Trump would have to understand that the safe zone would have consequences if violated, one-to-one consequences that perhaps, if General Petraeus just last week proposed that it would still be necessary, it would still be useful if we had a safe zone because it would protect so many people, because bombardments are still happening right now all across Syria. So there has to be consequences to anyone that violates the safe zone.
Adam, do you see that as plausible? I mean, you're looking at a regime that, frankly, is worse than untrustworthy, right? And you're looking at Russia, which repeatedly breaks agreements, right? I mean, from nuclear arms treaties down to, several, attempts at agreements, right, at establishing a peace there. Why would the U.S. trust those as partners?
Well, I don't think we can trust. And I think what we have to do as Americans, and maybe you call this arrogant, I don't know, is we have to remember and realize that we are the most powerful country in the world. On the battlefield, we will not be defeated. The only thing that will defeat us is our will. If we're outlasted or we're outwilled. Russia is not the equivalent of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Russia has an economy the size of Italy. The United States is the world leader in the economy. Our military, again, not that I'm advocating mil-mil fights with the Russians, but our military against the Russians, it would be a very one-sided fight. So what we have to do is, as well as playing a little game of carrot here, and you can talk about some of the sanctions as part of that, we have to be willing to use the stick, and we have to be willing to show the stick in terms of being able to get to a solution. When Russia or Syria bombs a United Nations aid convoy, it is absolutely unacceptable that there was not retaliatory strikes against the Assad regime as a result of that. And they need to be made aware that every action, every infraction, every humanitarian disaster will be met with the might of the U.S. and allied forces against their regime.
Against Syria?
It is against Syria.
You want to shoot at Russia. What if Russia broke? How do you
Russia has allied themselves with Syria. And so while nobody's going to be advocating bombing Russian equipment, I think it's important to say where we do have targets is against the regime. And the regime needs to know that violations in this humanitarian disaster will be met with power. And that is how, look, we can sit around and talk about how we all, we kind of want to sit down and come to agreements. And the only language Assad speaks is the language of strength. And that's why the Red Line failure was so disastrous, because it showed him that the United States was not willing, even though we were quite able, to back that up.
I agree on that, but the trouble is Assad also has Putin backing him. And how are you going to force Russia's hand then?
Well, I think you can force, it's two things. Look, Russia's design, I don't think Russia has any extreme affection for Bashar al-Assad. Russia, their play is to have a role in the Middle East. And they see Assad as, their best ally in that. I think two things. I also think there's nothing wrong with, if you declare a no-fly zone over a safe zone, for instance, and saying that the Russians are subject to that. Right? They will not challenge that safe zone. Trust me, if the Russians know you're serious, they are not going to challenge that safe zone. I mean, the Turkish military shot down a Russian aircraft.
Right.
So I think, look, to some people they're like, oh, he sounds like a war hawk and a warmonger. It's not that at all. I see 500,000 dead Syrians, and this idea of negotiation of peace, and this idea of sitting down at a table and having all kinds of talks in Geneva hasn't worked, and it won't work.
And
What I find
what's your reaction to that?
interesting about this is that the congressman was Air Force, right? So this, I understand, is the sort of nightmare scenario is U.S. planes and Russian planes in the air over Syria, and things go very wrong very quickly and escalate. So what do your colleagues in the Air Force say about how they could enforce a no-fly zone or fly over a safe zone and prevent the kind of horrible bombing and death that we have seen over the last
Well, technologically, it's extremely doable. And again, I think if President Trump, for instance, makes it very clear that this safe zone and this no-fly zone will be enforced, I would be blown away if you see the Russians challenge it. They will approach it. They'll do shows of force. That's normal. We would do the same thing. But to see them challenge and bomb in a no-fly zone, I don't think you'll see it. And I'll tell you, my colleagues in the military, and I still fly in the Guard, they're as dismayed at what's going on as all of us, and they are excited about the opportunity to protect this country and help you.
I see, that sounds good, but there are real risks involved there. And I know folks in the five-sided building who are nervous about the no-fly zone because they're worried about escalation, right? They know that what they don't. They know what they don't know is they don't know how Putin reacts to this kind of stuff. And there's been enormous miscalculation with Putin in Syria and Ukraine and elsewhere. Is it as simple as getting tough and backing up our word? And does this president, because this president is not particularly excited about investment of U.S. military personnel and resources in the Middle East, right? Are you convinced that he's going to go down that path?
He has talked about safe zones and supporting safe zones. As usual, he's been a little light on details and what that would entail. But he has been a proponent of safe zones throughout the campaign. So I see a potential interest from him. But it is incredibly complicated, and no one on this stage thinks this is an easy problem to solve, or it would have been solved earlier. No one wants to see what we're seeing in Syria. But there's really only a handful of outcomes here. We do nothing and hope that more nothing changes things. And it hasn't. It's only gotten worse. We go to war, which I don't think anyone here would want, although some of us would take that option if absolutely necessary. Or we try to have make some of these maneuvers that would immediately impact the lives of Syrian refugees in a very important way. And not just for them, by the way. I'm asked all the time, what's in it for us? Well, if you're someone like Donald Trump and you're scared of refugees coming into this country, solves that problem. If you're one of these economically strangled countries here,
solves the made-up problem.
well, solves his psyche's problem, yeah, but makes you happy. If you're one of these economically strangled countries that has taken in Syrian refugees, you feel some relief. And if you're a Syrian, you get to go home. So for me, all of the here's why we can't do that, I entertain that. I want to hear more about it. And I don't take that lightly. But I'm not of the we can't do anything. That's morally unacceptable to me. And so I want to engage on more kinds of ideas. And I hope that you guys do too. When you're talking about this in class, with your friends, with your family, engage in these ideas, because I don't see nothing as an option anymore.
The one thing I want to say too, and Essie's right on, this is beyond, again, this moment of human tragedy. You know, we're 50 years, a history book will be written about what happened and how this ended. By the way, this is not a fire in a house where the house is just going to burn down. This is a fire in an apartment building that is spreading to the next apartment, the next apartment. But the one thing, the point that I think gets lost in all this, in refugees and you know, the United States and other countries do a great job of trying to handle a tragic situation. But the refugees, when you have the next I call this the next generational fight on terror, right? We have current enemies that we have to fight. That takes kinetic action in many cases, capture, kill missions, etc. But the next generation can either be prone to terrorism recruitment, or they can be peaceful and want to live in a free world where they have opportunity and economic prosperity and chances. And when you have people that flee their home into temporary camps or to countries that may be unwelcoming or something like that, and they don't go to school, their opportunity to be successful diminishes every day. I was in a refugee camp in Turkey looking at this going, the Turks are doing as great of a job as they can to give these kids school in the second shift after their kids are in school, but they're losing opportunity to learn, which makes them more prone to be drawn into that next generation.
Nora was making exactly that point on the way.
Yeah.
Exactly. And working with Syrian people from Jordan, I mean, you've got people living in the middle of the desert under a tent that has been given to them by the United Nations. They don't have running water. They don't have electricity. They don't have schools. They're not vaccinated. They live where there are, I had just gone in June and went to this area where you think it's no man's land and no one can live there. There are all these tents dispersed everywhere. And I started crying because I just cannot believe the conditions some people were living in. I mean, this mother had given birth to a baby that was clearly had some physical disabilities, and they, you know, she hasn't been to a hospital. Like, what, I mean, can you imagine these kids? I look at them and I think, ISIS comes to these tents and offers them $200 a month to go bomb themselves. Are they gonna do it? They have no tools to survive. They have no education, nothing to look forward to, and they're abandoned, and not by choice. So it's in our best interest, it's in the world's best interest to get these people back home, back where they can be educated, back where they can rebuild, back to where they're not displaced anymore.
They say in Afghanistan that the Taliban begins where the road ends, right? I really think it's about hope, right? And all the extremism is fertile ground where there's no hope.
Yeah.
I want to go, please go ahead and just prepare your questions because I want to turn to the audience right after this.
So I think it's unfair to say nothing has happened in the last 6 years. I think what's fair to say is the Obama administration has ended and the war has not. But during that time period, the U.S. was the leading donor of international humanitarian assistance, $5.9 billion. We were intensively involved in trying to get aid both to the refugees in the countries around Syria and also inside Syria through every possible channel to get there. The thing is, aid does not protect someone when a bomb is falling on their head. An initiative that was worked out with the UN to get chemical weapons out of Syria was very important and successful up to a point. I think you're right to say we have subsequently seen chemical weapons used in Syria. And you're right to say that we can't trust Assad. And Assad seems to have ambitions to retake all of the territory. So it's not clear to me that his involvement in setting up, not setting up, but in honoring a safe zone or a safe haven would be a really big question, I think.
Just very briefly, do you think President Obama regrets the decision not to enforce the red line deep down?
I don't know.
You won't speculate. You're too smart to speculate. I'll speculate. Anyway, why don't we start with you? If you could just say your name and then fire away.
My name is Alec Kim. Hi, Congressman, I have a question for you. You said earlier that the reason we can't get boots on the ground in the Middle East is because it hasn't been sold properly to the American people. Given how poorly our past involvement in the Middle East has gone in the power vacuum you've recently left, what would be your sales pitch to the American people, not just that we have a moral obligation to act, that our actions would actually improve the situation?
Well, I would argue a couple things. Number one, Afghanistan's way better now than before our involvement in it. War is tough, war is messy, war takes a long time sometimes. We're used to microwave wars where they're over like Desert Storm. Afghanistan is in a far better position. I think Iraq, once they clear out ISIS, will be in a far better position. I think it was in 2011. So I don't necessarily accept the premise of the question, but to answer the question of how do you sell it, look, I could argue that Brexit happened because of a culture clash in Europe that happened from a mass refugee crisis. I can tell you that when refugees exit Syria, we're draining Syria of the very people that are going to be needed to secure it post-Assad. I can point to the fact that you have a very destabilized situation in Jordan. I can point to ISIS attacks in the United States and in Europe, which people are paying attention to. And ISIS, by the way, is a direct result of Bashar al-Assad. There are some that argue that it's either Assad or ISIS. I think it's actually the direct opposite. I think Assad created ISIS. And so, and you can point that back to the very origin of the first few thousand people let out of jail, to the fact that people join ISIS because they see no alternative to this brutal dictator that killed their parents and killed their kids. And so I think to make that point is, look, nobody's advocating. I have not heard a single person, even the most hawkish among us, ever advocate for 300,000 troops in Syria. Nobody's doing that. But there are limited military things we can do that as the world's superpower we're obligated to do that I think can help stabilize it, not alone, but with a broad-based coalition. Thank you.
very much. How about this side?
Hi, my name's Hunter. I'm a sophomore here at the School of Foreign Service. Thank you very much for asking. I think it's a really important discussion. I was wondering, moving beyond, let's make the assumption that safe spaces, safe zones within Syria are possible in the short term. Is there a bipartisan long-term solution? Does it involve removing Assad from power? And then, if so, where do we go from there?
That is the tricky next bit. I remember in a speech that President Obama gave 2012, 13 maybe, he said it's not a question of if Assad goes, but when. That's to the right of many Republicans right now, who don't believe in ousting Assad for many reasons. He is, without a doubt, a genocidal dictator and a brutal, evil person. But one could make the argument that he would be a stabilizing force in Syria. That is an argument that some people make. For me, and I'm happy to let other people answer themselves, but for me, I'm interested in securing the safety of as many Syrians as possible in the immediate. What happens politically next, I want to get to after that's done.
Stem of leaving, right? Stem of leaving
Right.
and go. Anybody else want to pipe in?
Well, I think every day that goes by, our options become less and less. I mean, it's sadly the case. And the so-called good rebels, the moderate rebels, are being killed every day by barrel bombs, precision strikes. By the way, the Russians are using, in essence, GPS-guided bombs and then denying that they intended to hit a hospital. We hit a hospital in Afghanistan on accident, and it's massive international news and apologies and all this. They bombed 20 of them, and there's not a peep out of the UN or anybody else over this. I think that's important.
Or the president.
Or the president. And so I think, from an endpoint solution, you have safe zones set up, you can stabilize the situation. I think it's important to know what happened around the red line. I'm not castigating blame, this is just kind of historic. Before the red line, there was all kinds of discussion about how do we remove Assad from office? Is it he's toppled, or do we give him a peaceful way to go to Brazil or something like that? After that red line failed to be enforced, there was never discussion about how to get Assad out of office. So again, maybe I sound like a war hawk here, but I think there has to be a point in the post where there is a threat of force to remove him from power, because he doesn't want to die, trust me. And that's why he's killing 500,000 people, so he can live. There has to be a threat of that, and then the carrot side is, here's your offshoot and way to get out. And then we have to be invested as the international community in building a post-Assad regime. And just one more quick point. People use Libya as an example of why we shouldn't intervene. If you compare Libya today with its challenges to Syria today, Libya is exactly the reason and exactly the example of how much better it could be if there was intervention. While Libya has challenges, they're working through those challenges, and there's not a 500,000 dead Libyans.
Laura, what do you need to feel for the next step? You know, after, say there's a safe zone to allow people to live without having barrel bombs dropped on their head. How would it look to you to make you feel comfortable to say, go home?
I mean, I would definitely have to see consequences for anyone that violates the safe zone. That's something that Assad has to be accountable for, because if he's not, it's going to continue. But nonetheless, I think the violence will significantly decrease with the safe zone. But I would need to see an international cooperation, actually, not just the United States. I mean, the UK has expressed interest in helping. The Saudis have expressed interest, the Turks, the Jordanians, and all these countries have an invested interest in having this succeed because they're affected by this huge refugee crisis. So that's something I would have to see.
Your turn.
Hi, my name's Alex. So bear with me, my question is a little bit convoluted, but assuming we can set up safe zones, how do you, in a very unstable region, how do you enforce the safe zone? How do you make sure that, kids can go to school without, say we shot down a Russian bomber because they were about to drop a bomb on the safe zone? How do you keep enforcing the safety of those people without necessarily sending off, more unintended consequences and destabilizing the region even more? And, kind of building off of that question, how do we keep doing that while we do have someone in power who doesn't seem interested in, guaranteeing cooperation for the safety of civilians?
So your question is, how do you enforce the safe zone without sparking a bigger war? Is that the idea? Okay. Who wants to take that? Solve our problems, Adam.
Well, I think there's...
No pressure. Well, that is the challenge.
Yeah, I think there's risk in everything. But let's look at what inaction has done. Let's look at what a lack of, let's look at what a fear of escalation has led to. And I would argue that this tragedy in Syria and the tragedy in the broader Middle East has put us in way more danger than the risk of a shooting conflict with Russia. Now, anybody that believes that enforcement of a safe zone is going to lead to World War III, I think that's way a bridge too far. But the Russians, with 30-some aircraft in the Middle East, half of which are broken at any given time, know that they do not have the ability to challenge the Air Force of the United States. I'm not advocating, again, for mill-to-mill conflicts on this. But the willingness sometimes to use the stick, as Roosevelt said, sometimes the willingness to use that makes the use of it all much less likely. And again, is there a risk? Absolutely. And I don't want to downplay that. But I do look at, I was told when I was advocating for bombing the Red Line in Syria, as one of the only Republicans very public about supporting the president in bombing the Red Line, in enforcing the Red Line. I was told that enforcing the Red Line would lead to this huge disaster, and that doing nothing would be better by some people. Doing nothing has been way beyond the worst disaster anybody ever predicted to me. So I think, again, while there's no easy answer, no safe answer, there never is in international conflict, what we've seen as the result so far is this is the shame of the 21st century.
I think that the Obama administration felt that the best chance for peace was to pursue peace diplomatically, and clearly Secretary Kerry put in hours and hours and frequent flyer miles into pursuing that, and has left office without having achieved it. But there were diplomatic successes along the way where the killing dipped down, but it was not permanent. And so I think a lot of those people who backed that approach continue to defend it today. The High Commissioner for Refugees was just in Aleppo, and he came out and said he doesn't see the possibility for a safe zone, and he thinks the energy that can go into a safe zone should be poured into a peace, in part because what's inside the country is so fragmented, and you have so many different groups, and you have the ISIS threat that straddles these two countries, Syria and Iraq. And there is progress on the battlefield in Iraq to push them back, but none of this seems very easy to do.
Well, let me ask you this. I'm curious. The U.S. invaded Iraq, right, and used force, right, tremendous force, and left a certainly, in the best case, an uncertain legacy there. Avoided intervening in Syria, left an uncertain legacy there. Not that it's all in the U.S., but still. Does anybody in Syria trust the U.S. to solve the problem? What confidence do they have?
I mean, I think a lot of people in Syria were counting on the U.S. to have taken action much earlier. But I do think that there is still hope in Syria for the U.S. to do the right thing. It's not too late. Like I said, the former director of the CIA, General Petraeus, he said and he proposed a solution as to how we can keep these zones safe. And it's by if Russian planes flew in these safe zones, he would attack the Syrian regime versus Russia. But to be honest, I just think we have a different relationship with Russia with its current administration. I think their eagerness to warm up to our administration and to be this peace broker in the Middle East, I have a belief and hope that they will work with the current administration much better than they would have in the previous one.
Hi, I'm a junior here. My name's Tyler. I'm a junior in government and history major.
What's your name?
Tyler, my name's Tyler. So my question is primarily for the congressman, and it's a political one. So
I mean, that's my job.
ask the right guy, right? Given Congresswoman Gabbard's recent trip in Aberdeen, I don't know if you can comment on this, but was anyone in the House Foreign Affairs aware of it? Do any members plan on taking any action? Do you see that as a constructive role that she's now decided to play, or position she's decided to take? And it seems like there's some movement in the Senate side on Syria, possibly. Do you see any movement happening in the House?
So I never, ever do I ever comment on a colleague's actions personally, except in this case. And,
Explain what she did too.
So
Yeah.
I basically wake up. We were in Philadelphia for our Republican retreat, and find out that Tulsi Gabbard, Congresswoman from Hawaii, went to Syria, met twice with Bashar al-Assad, and find out later this trip was paid for by a kind of an anti-Israel shadow group, probably money funneled through Assad. I mean, who knows that part? So this was the first time I broke my rules. And I'll say this. Somebody can argue, and it's a legitimate argument, I disagree with it, but somebody can argue that Bashar al-Assad is better than the alternative. I disagree, but it's an argument that can be had. What you don't do as an American policymaker, no matter even if you believe that, what you don't do is go meet with somebody that killed half a million people and 50,000 children. Because you are used as a prop to legitimize an evil dictatorship. And I was very clear and open, and it probably cost me a friendship, and because I do consider Tulsi a friend, but to legitimize the genocide of 500,000 Syrians and 50,000 children is a disgrace. And it was something that I was ashamed of. And for me, there is no lawmaker of the United States that should ever go do anything like that, even if you agree with him versus the alternative.
Why do you think she won?
Because, truthfully, for the news, I think part of it's that. I think part of it is, I don't know, maybe a belief that somehow, dictatorships work, I guess. I don't know. But I could point to, again, I can prove to you, if we had the time, how ISIS exists because of Assad. Without Assad, there would not be an ISIS.
We have, I think, 10 minutes by my clock, so we've got time for a few more questions.
Thank you for coming. My name is Joey. This is more of a general question. A lot of what's been talked about is the logistics of enforcing and establishing a safe zone, allowing refugees to return home. But my question is, if that was possible, can you speak to some of the possible dangers, difficulties in bringing back refugees who may be in Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, other parts of Syria, back to that safe zone? What that might entail?
Yeah, how would you pull that off? Who wants to start on that? You
Well,
have
let's say
experience.
peace comes to Syria, which we're all praying for. Then Syria has lost, according to the UN Development Program, 30 years of development. People don't have jobs anymore because the places where they work were bombed, the schools have been bombed, the hospitals and clinics have been bombed. So it's going to take a while to get things back up. to where Syria was before. I visited Syria in 2008 because I was thanking the Syrian government for, as part of a delegation of people, thanking the Syrian government for hosting so many Iraqi refugees. And, you know, not being Syrian American, I had never been there before, and I was overwhelmed by the history and the sort of historical archaeological riches and peacefulness, the beauty of Damascus, and so, and everyone said, oh, but you have to go to Aleppo. So, you know, this is going to be a major undertaking. What Congressman mentioned before is absolutely right. People thought we would be reconstructing Syria before now, and we're not. So because the war has ground on and on and on, and the groups have splintered, and the opposition did not sweep to victory, the destruction has been even more extensive. And the other piece that a theme that has sort of picked up the panel is the need to educate a whole generation of Syrian children. And you know, we've talked about this on campus before. You know, not having a lost generation of youth, because Syria's going to need engineers and you know, municipal leaders and people to put all the pieces back together again. It's going to be very, very daunting.
Well, there's going to be a legacy of it's a crisis of the psyche, right? I mean, beyond the education, right? It's a lasting effect.
It's been a tremendous amount of trauma.
There's a lot of trauma.
Well, and that's the survivors.
Yeah.
And, you know, we should be clear to point out, as awful and horrific as the conditions are, they survived. We count them lucky. But there are plenty of Syrian doctors and engineers who are refugees living in other countries and other towns where they are working as janitors, if they're working at all. And this talent is going to waste. There's a total brain drain. And like everyone has said, every passing day, this gets worse and worse and worse for an entire generation, an entire population of people.
Is it just a big picture question, and I want to come to you. Are we missing? So we're all talking about a safe zone. There was a little talk of pursuing peace, maybe enforced with force, right? But are we missing some sort of? There are no real alternatives, then, are there?
I
Are we
think
talking about a bipartisan solution? Is there some other miracle?
Well, I think there are. I
Also,
think
safe zones are have bipartisan support.
Yeah.
Sure.
Doesn't
No,
hurt
it's
just to be-
no, but I'm saying, like, if we're looking at the function of the discussion is to look for a bipartisan
Yeah.
solution, are we missing some other?
Well, look, I think the ultimate solution to Syria is Assad gone. And I mean, if the American people were willing to back, and the coalition, whatever it looked like, was willing to back what was necessary to do it, it could be done.
Yeah, but who's going to? I mean,
Well,
this
the
is
question
the
is
myth of, like,
government.
there are 1,000 leaders we want gone, but then the guy who backs them up might be just as bad or worse. The man or the woman who back, right?
I mean, look at his dad, right?
His
His father killed my grandfather. I've never met my grandfather. You know, he buried an entire city in homes,
yeah.
right? He buried the entire city and killed everybody living there at the time. And look at the son. I mean, what are we going to wait for the next son to come along and destroy the rest of
The reformist son.
Exactly. And we will, I mean, truly, as a Syrian American, I remember thinking, I was like, yes, this guy is educated in Europe. He's going to be great.
Married
He's going to be
to,
great. Married to, she's British,
British.
and British educated, very modern, very, you know, seemed very, they'll unite the country. And I was really looking forward and happy to see him take rule, and then look where we are today. So I do not want to see another Assad in charge. So I would agree with you.
My name is Rochelle, and I actually lived in Aleppo my entire life. Shout out. Wow. And I'm actually intrigued because I think, honestly, I would say in my community, my community personally never see our opinion portrayed anywhere in the media. So my question is, why always shame the Assad regime when literally it is the only political and diplomatic entity that anyone can communicate with in Syria?
I tend to disagree. I mean, I'm not shaming anyone. You just have to look at their actions, right? I'm just looking at his actions.
They shame themselves.
They shame themselves. I mean, this is not a community I'm shaming. It's a person that's done bad things.
But I mean, I know from where I come from, in the media, in the Western media, he is always portrayed as a dictator. but every
He
time he
is.
does
He
something,
is a dictator.
okay, I
He
mean
portrays
something on
himself
that.
as a
But
dictator.
every time he does something good, nobody acknowledges that.
What
I
has he
know,
done that's good?
I know my family was really happy when part of Aleppo was retaken by the government because they could live safely. They weren't.
Okay, so
constantly
it's
bombed.
okay that 100,000 people were evicted from their homes, and you consider that
I
safe?
I went up and spoke at Lehigh University, fine university, not as good as this one, but it was fun. And what I was unaware of was how many Syrian Americans live in that part of Pennsylvania. And so we had a really strong turnout of people who were Syrian Americans, but had family in Syria who were pro-Assad. And they were very unhappy with the things that I was saying. Oops, don't touch the mic. That I was saying, because there's a sense that minorities, Alawites and Christians, have the best chance of surviving if they back him.
Because he is Alawite himself.
Yeah.
Well, I would just say.
So that was for me interesting, not just that there were Syrians who supported him, but Syrian Americans as well.
Well, if he can resurrect 500,000 people and create 500,000 new lives, then I think he's at least on part of it.
50,000 children.
50,000 children. Until then, I'm going to shame the hell out of him.
But what about this? And I'm certainly not going to defend Assad, but you have, in the wake of a conflict like this, right? And you saw this in Iraq. You have score settling. You have the opening of these sectarian divisions, right? And you saw that, right? We saw that in Iraq. And of course, Donald Trump has made this argument about Saddam Hussein, right? He kept him under wraps. And again, I'm not defending Saddam Hussein, God knows. But I'm saying, how do you handle those, not just the score settling, but the divisions, the history of these recent years in any post-war settlement? How do you get these communities to feel protected? Because Christians, I know many Syrian Christians who will make the same argument to me, right? They'll say, but he kept me safe, right? So how do you make them feel safe as well in any settlement?
Yeah, but I think this is a bit unique in that, so the source of Assad's paranoia and fragility is the fact that he is himself minority Shia in a majority Sunni country, and within Shia, minority Alawite. So he knows that he cannot depend on democracy to keep him in power. Democratic levers aren't going to do it because he is a minority. And so I think that's why when he saw this uprising in the street, he thought, okay, if I want to stick around and hold on to this power, I'm going to have to do it by brute force and as a dictator. So I'm not sure that the factions, the Shiites and the Sunnis, are hating each other on the ground, as is the case in some other parts of the region. I just think this is about Assad wanting to remain in power. And so...
And I agree with that.
Yeah.
I guess I'm just saying, you know, the future of Syria, like in Iraq, I mean, you have to find a power-sharing agreement that makes sides feel empowered, because that, you know, if you look at the support for ISIS in Iraq, part of that was a defensiveness on the part of the minority Sunnis, right? You know, they might not have loved ISIS, but they're like, at least, you know, they're not the Shiite militias, right?
Right.
So that's the difficult, that's the follow-on difficulty.
You have to remember, Syria has coexisted, you know, all factions within Syria have coexisted for hundreds of years. Christians and Jews until they were pushed out by Assad and forced to leave. Jews and Christians and Muslims all lived together, different sects, and they've flourished together. I mean, you go into the old Aleppo city and you see all these different foods represented, and it truly is, they loved each other and helped each other and lived in a very neighborly fashion. And so I think, you know, there's a lot of fear-mongering that Assad created to push his agenda, and he was very successful at it, unfortunately, with some factions of the country. But I do believe that a future Syria would be for all Syrians.
It is sad when you look at the region, that so many of the region's countries and cities were more diverse years and generations ago, right? You know, this impression that you're always moving in a progressive direction, you know, that's been robbed from us. I hate to say, I think time's up. Maybe just, if you have a quick final question, we'll give you a chance.
Yeah, thanks so much. My name is Omar. I'm a Syrian American. My question is about the Iranian role. Ever since the Iran nuclear deal went into effect, the regime's got they got $1 billion credit line from Iran to Assad. Thousands of IRGC and Hezbollah fighters came to the country in 2015, 2016. According to recent reports, the Iranians and their proxies are one of the most major causes of the displacement and the refugee crisis that we see on the ground, especially in the past about 6 or 8 months. We hear talk about Iran being on notice with the latest administration. What do you think? How could the safe zones work to push back the Iranian role, or what can be done to push the Iranian role back in Syria? Thanks.
Well, I think obviously Iran's role in Syria and the larger Middle East is extremely concerning. I actually think the Trump administration has said some very good things and been very strong so far against Iran. I think the discussion about ballistic missiles will not be tolerated led to the defueling of a missile off the pad. I think
Then they fired one like 2 days later.
And then when the threats against the straits and against the freedom of seas, I think they well understand that they're on warning now. But there's no doubt Iran has played, in fact, Hezbollah obviously has played a gigantic role in propping up Assad. So that's another thing, this argument about Assad or terrorism. I think Hezbollah is terrorists and they're actually on his side. And if I'm Israel, I'm worried because they have a lot of training now. And so, I think, the administration here has an opportunity potentially to, if they in fact do negotiate with Russia, which I wouldn't advocate, but if they do, I think they have an opportunity to break the relationship between Russia and Iran in that negotiation. But I think a lot of that is obviously up in the air, and we don't know. But there's no doubt the Iranian role has expanded in the last few years.
See,
I just want to say one thing. I'm sure you all remember a viral moment from the campaign where someone who's actually running for president said, "What is Aleppo?" Gary Johnson. There's a reason, because we don't have enough conversations like this about it. And so I want to thank everyone on this stage, GU Politics, Georgetown, and everyone for showing up, because I'm so glad we had a forum to have this discussion. So thank you all for coming.
Stay engaged.
Thanks to everyone on the panel for an incredibly important conversation. And thanks to all of you for being part of it. Please follow along. Please keep the conversation going. We believe very strongly that these conversations shouldn't end at the end of an hour or be confined within 4 walls. So go on social media at GU Politics, on whatever platform you choose. We're probably there at GU Politics. Please keep the conversation going, and we hope to see you at the next event. Thank you.